St. Augustine is not just a city in Florida. He is a saint in the early church, born around 354 AD, which is post-Nicene, and it places his life right around the official canon of Scripture being established, which would have happened in the late 380s. Born to a non-believer and a devout Christian, his mother Monica, whom he credits with his conversion to Christianity, he was baptized at age 33. Augustine spent his youth questioning the faith of his mother and exploring different philosophies of the time. He mainly followed Manichaeism for some time before leaving and going out to hear the bishop of Milan preach. Augustine taught rhetoric in Milan, so he went to the bishop in order to hear what he had to say, right? He wanted to hear how he preached. It was this sermon that convicted him, and he began to re-examine all of the philosophies that he had held so dearly. Eventually, he turned from his life of extensive debauchery and was baptized into the faith. He decided to become a monk and took his son, which he had actually had in his life of sexual proclivity, on a journey with him to his hometown, where he learned of his mother's passing. Her example of faith was a deep inspiration from him, as he talks about in his most famous work, Confessions. We will talk about several of his important works, but just like with Justin Martyr, we will not discuss all of them, because he has over 200 books, and I have a life. But since I mentioned Confessions, let's talk about that first. It's 13 books long, and it begins as an autobiography of sorts, book 1 through 9. And he uses his life events to demonstrate the truth of Scripture and evidence from his own life. In youth, he pursued sexual gratification and material wealth, but like Solomon, he found it rather empty. And after exploring Manichaeism, skepticism, and Neoplatonism, he converted to Christianity out of reason, logic, and most importantly, the wonderful example of his mother. So he does this sort of exegesis of Genesis to kind of also parallel with his life and to show the different stages at which he progressed. It really is incredible to see the profound impact that this sort of teaching had, right? This is sort of expository, and it's really where this idea of expository, at least in the modern context, develops, right? And especially in terms of the application to his own life and saying, this is where I saw this. This is where this moment in Scripture applied to my life. A lot of people didn't do that before Augustine. He was really kind of a trendsetter in that sense. I would recommend, if you're going to read any book of Augustine, it would be either Confessions or the next book that we are going to talk about, which is The City of God. This is a full dissertation of 22 books against the pagan accusation regarding Vandals conquering Rome because of Christianity. See, the Vandals had just conquered the capital of the former Roman Empire, being, well, obviously Rome, and a lot of pagans who were still clinging to their old ways blamed the Roman Empire's adoption of Christianity for its downfall, saying that it made them soft and that because of their lack of faith in the gods had abandoned Rome to the Vandals. However, Augustine turns to history and reason here, and he points out several terrible things that have befallen Rome, even while Rome was still a very pagan city. And he does this in a similar fashion to Justin Martyr, pointing out the debased actions of the pagan gods and showing that really the pagan gods were never in control or were never great to begin with. They were morally corrupt, they were horrible beings, they did awful things, they thought many, many, many evil things. He just keeps on railing against the pagan gods in a very pointed way. In Book 11, he begins talking about the creation of the city of God on earth and the city of God in heaven. And he sort of sets it up as a dichotomy, but in the end he brings them together, as the city on earth should reflect the city in heaven, right? Kind of the earth reflecting heaven. And then he, in subsequent books, talks about how the Old Testament has clearly set up Christ and the church in the same sense, right? That the church should reflect Christ, and he ties the Old Testament into that. In the final 3 books of the City of God, he emphasizes the importance of salvation as the last judgment is coming. This book is extremely important to modern political philosophy. As before, people like Aristotle had sort of said that morality should dictate politics, but it's really this book that has influenced so much of Western philosophy and a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment and even the founding of America. A lot of these morality-based laws and this idea that morality should be the center driving force in politics comes from Augustinian thought. So his reach and depth is so powerful that he actually shaped an entire hemisphere of the world. Chances are you think like Augustine and you didn't even know it, because he is so influential in that sense. And another way he's been influential is his reading on the Psalms. It is an extensive commentary of the Book of Psalms, focusing heavily on the Christological implications, alongside the abiding worship of God present in each and every psalm. It shaped how we read the entire book of the Bible, right? That entire book, and how we think about it from a Christian perspective. Almost all of that comes primarily from Augustine's commentary here. It's extremely helpful in understanding some of the more difficult passages, and is quite essential if you are trying to figure out all of the places that Christian doctrine fits in with the Psalms. Another place that's very helpful to read for him is his discussion of the Sermon on the Mount. It is another in-depth commentary, and it discusses the law and its completion. To quote from the great saint, "The New Testament lies in the Old, and the Old Testament is unveiled in the New." Right, so he's kind of hitting on that idea that's so succinctly wrapped up in Matthew 5:17, right? That Christ has come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He ties that all together nicely in his commentary, and it has very much impacted the way that we search for connections between the Old and New Testament. Similarly, in his homilies of the Gospel, he sort of does a harmony of the Gospel study, and it spends a lot of time debunking alleged issues with the Gospel. And contained within this book of his are over 100 sermons on the Gospel of John alone. Often lumped in with this would be his homilies on the book of 1 John, as well as many of his teachings regarding the Gospels. Some also included in the Sermon on the Mount. And the anti-penultimate thing that we are going to talk about is De Trinitate, the doctrinal treatises and the moral treatises. This is a series of works, both laying out a series of doctrines. De Trinitate, the doctrinal treatises, is proof through philosophy and reason for the Trinity entirely from Scripture. He uses Scripture as a common ground for those who do affirm it to show clearly that all three persons are fully divine, fully unique, and all one in nature. The language and argumentation that he uses is still commonly used today. It does feed a little bit off of Justin Martyr, but primarily it feeds off of the Council of Nicaea and what was determined therein. Moral treatises is his much briefer discussion on the ethics of Christianity and where they stem from. His understanding of Christian morality, as I said, was essential to Western understanding of liberty as a moral value and the necessity of moral society. So that brings us to the penultimate work that we're going to discuss, Against the Manichaeans. This was a systematic debunking of the Gnostic heretic Faustus the Manichaean. Manichaeism states that good and evil are always battling and are equal forces. The only way to achieve spiritual peace is secret enlightened knowledge from the prophet Mani, and incorporates a lot of Christian principles of morality and claims that Jesus is actually a manifestation of the good and spiritual forces, making him divine. Augustine thoroughly debunks every claim that Faustus makes and asserts through the words of Jesus himself that he is the one true God incarnate. This is foundational for modern Christological argumentation and has even been used to argue against systems of thought like Buddhism and Jainism and even Taoism. Finally, ultimately, we reach the anti-Pelagian writings. And the reason I want to talk about this one is it's often taken out of context by people who argue against Catholics and say that they are arguing for a works-based salvation. Instead, really, it argues against Pelagius, a heretic who believed in works-based salvation. It makes clear the soteriological doctrine of sola gratia, which is by grace alone, which Catholics would affirm. We disagree, then, Catholics and Protestants, on the exact terms of our relationship to God's grace, but we both agree, primarily through Augustinian thought, that it is only by God's grace that we are saved. We still often use this polemic, however, against those who state that they can make it to heaven based on their own merits. So, what happened to good old Augustine after he wrote all of this? Well, he dies in 430 of illness, bedridden, but still praising God. He remains one of the most influential figures not only in all of Christian history, but in all of Western history, and is so critically important to our understanding of morality and of politics. His works help us to understand the Old Testament, clarify doctrine, and refute many heresies that persist today. It can help us with errors that we are making while reading Scripture, or even to help clarify some unclear positions. His political philosophy has helped to build the great Western nations that still stand strong today. His views on morality and politics have guided over a millennia and a half of political thought. Augustine is more foundational to Western Christianity and Western history than any other person. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope that this dive into the life and teachings of Augustine of Hippo has been enlightening. And next week you can look forward to another video on church history. With all that said, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know if you'd like to see us discuss any other church history figures or perhaps events. And we will see you, Lord willing, in the next video. Bye, guys.